Hey everyone, so chapter 1000 of One Piece is just around the corner and expectations are obviously very, very high. I think I have a pretty clear idea of what seems most likely to happen in chapter 1000, but before we get into that, make sure to subscribe for more One Piece content like this every week. So to start with, let me just remind people that sometimes our expectations can go beyond what logically makes sense for the story. For example, more often than not, I see these milestones come, chapter 800, chapter 900 and such, and everyone believes that the entire story is set to be flipped on its head each time these marker chapters come around. And usually what we get is a really good chapter rather than something that is absolutely out of this world. For example, chapter 900 was a really unique chapter, but I think most would agree that chapter 903, just a few chapters later where Luffy was announced as the 5th Emperor, could be considered a much bigger deal. Now, obviously chapter 1000 is even more important than something like 700, chapter 800, chapter 900, etc. I mean, how many series actually get to 1000 chapters? But what I'm trying to say is that with this video, I'm going to be focusing on what actually makes sense as a big event that fits in with where we're at in the flow of the story at the moment. Because I see a lot of theories talking about things like how we're going to get a cutaway to the outside world for some crazy event, or maybe some huge revelation, or maybe we get to see Im for the first time ever, and I just don't think that that's the case. I don't think Oda's going to abruptly cut away from crucial events in Wano just to force in some random crazy event for chapter 1000. To add to that, something interesting that people have talked about that I personally subscribe to is the idea that Wano's acts may be following a pattern in terms of length, where Act 1 was 15 chapters, followed by one chapter cutting away to the outside world. Then Act 2 was 30 chapters, followed by 2 chapters cutting away to the outside world, and it feels like Act 3 is coming up close to its end, and in my opinion is very likely to be 45 chapters long if it follows this pattern of 15, then 30, then 45. In that case, if Act 3 is 45 chapters, then Act 3 is set to end at chapter 1002. That would mean we wouldn't be cutting away to the outside world till chapter 1003. That makes a lot of sense to me personally, as it does give us a little more time to get to a good stopping point in Onigashima, a conclusion for the act before cutting away. If the act ends at, chapter 999 just so we can cut to the outside world at chapter 1000, then I don't really think that gives us much time to bring things to a good stopping point, since at the moment we have so many plot threads in motion. More importantly, Act 3 of Kabuki plays are known for culminating in a great moment of tragedy, and with the tone of the battle shifting to become pretty worrisome for the Straw Hats, as well as the Scabbards up there on the dome fighting against Kaido by themselves, I think we are set up for some tragedy to happen, and it's more likely that we're staying in Wano a little bit longer for that to happen before the act concludes and we cut away. So all that being said, what do I think is going to happen? Well, I believe there are two options. I believe chapter 1000 will either be the chapter that Luffy arrives at the top of Onigashima to face Kaido, or it will be a chapter of Luffy getting brutally defeated by Kaido for a second time. Now, even if you don't think Luffy is going to lose to Kaido again, either way what I'm saying is that chapter 1000 will be Luffy and Kaido related, with the two at least squaring off. The simplest reason is that it looks like we're on a pretty clear countdown to Luffy facing Kaido, based on the levels of Onigashima. Recently we got to see the levels of Onigashima laid out that Luffy needs to climb up to get to the top. And we've seen that Luffy is climbing the levels at about roughly the rate of 1 level per chapter. In chapter 993, Luffy was in the basement. In 994, he was at level 1. He didn't move up in 995, but in 996, he's reached level 2. And at the end of 996, it looks like they're about to hit level 3. So at 997, he should probably be on level 3. So about 1 level per chapter it looks like. I know other people have commented on this, but it does seem like a pretty clear trend, and it makes sense to me. Because guess what? If we follow this trend, then chapter 998 will be Luffy on level 4, in chapter 999 Luffy will be on level 5, and then chapter 1000 Luffy will be at the top. So, following that trend, Luffy should get to Kaido at about chapter 1000, and Oda will most likely use that to end the chapter as the cliffhanger, having Luffy arriving to face Kaido at the end of the chapter. I don't think there's any situation where Oda would have Luffy just reach Kaido and immediately have them start fighting in the same chapter, because that's just not as dramatic as ending a chapter with the matchup being set, and then the next chapter having the fight actually start. However, what Oda could do is show Luffy on level 5 in chapter 999, which is where he's supposed to be in chapter 999 following this pace, and then have the chapter end with Luffy going up that last flight of stairs to face Kaido as the final panel of chapter 999. If that's the case, then I'm confident that chapter 1000 is going to be Luffy versus Kaido, round 2, and with the exact same conclusion as the first time, but hopefully more brutal. For anyone new to my channel, if you don't know, I've been saying for a long time that this whole Onigashima raid is set to end in complete defeat for the Straw Hat Alliance's side, which is why I am personally saying chapter 1000 would be Luffy getting defeated by Kaido, and not just the start of their long final battle. I'm not going to get into the details about why that is here. You can check out my video on that in the links below, and there will be more videos talking about that in the future. If you want a simple reason, I'll throw in here that why Luffy may lose to Kaido again at the conclusion of Act 3, is that if we humor the idea that Act 3 is set to be 45 chapters long, and therefore is set to end at chapter 1002, then that does basically put us nicely on pace for an ending similar to Act 1 of Wano. Luffy meets up with Kaido in chapter 999 or 1000, we get a chapter of Luffy's defeat, then 1 or 2 more chapters after the defeat before the end of the act. Even if you don't buy that, the bottom line is that chapter 1000 is most likely going to be in Onigashima. It's most likely going to be something involving Luffy and Kaido. So, does this live up to the hype that a chapter 1000 should warrant? Well, look, maybe it's not as crazy as what some predictions were calling for. We're not going to find out what the Will of D is. We're not going to learn about Im. We're not going to see Dragon versus Akainu or something. We're basically going to get something that we all already knew was going to happen during this battle, which was Luffy facing off with Kaido. And here I'm going to give my personal perspective on Oda's general focus on these chapter numbers in the past. We've all seen how Oda tends to line up things such that certain chapters come out at certain times, like the date of Blackbeard's bounty reveal, the date of Oden's execution lining up with Oden Day in Japan, Luffy's Gear 4th being revealed on the reverse chapter number of Luffy's Gear 2nd reveal, etc. At times, we praise Oda a lot for things like that. Other times, we say that Oda may be rushing to have a certain event happen at a certain chapter just for the sake of it. Here's the thing. I personally think it's more so that Oda is writing an incredibly long, incredibly ambitious story with a tremendous number of moving parts and plot threads. And it's most likely that Oda's way of setting a sort of pace to the story that he wants to stick to is by using certain chapter numbers as rough deadlines. I think Oda was more freeform with things pre-time skip, but I think since the time skip, you can see clear increments of what storylines Oda is trying to complete within a given span of 100 chapters. So, for example, starting from roughly chapter 600, we got Fishman Island, which was about 50 chapters, and then Punk Hazard, which was about another 50 chapters, and then Dressrosa conveniently begins at pretty much exactly chapter 700. So basically, Oda probably planned the 600 to 700 range to cover Fishman Island and Punk Hazard, and to get us to Dressrosa by the start of the 700s. Then Dressrosa itself was another nice even 100 chapters, ending at about chapter 800. Then, from 800 to 900, we got Zou and Whole Cake Island, with Whole Cake Island wrapping up almost exactly at chapter 900. And with Wano being such a long storyline, I would bet he planned that the first half of Wano should be complete by around chapter 1000, meaning basically Act 3 should end around chapter 1000. Like, pre-time skip, I think Oda was looser with this sort of thing. Alabasta didn't have to end at chapter 200, Enies Lobby didn't end at chapter 400, etc. I just think that since the time skip, Oda has a more definite roadmap to the end of the series, and I think there are endpoints he wants to hit by the end of each 100 chapter stretch from here on. Like, by chapter 700, we need to be starting the Dressrosa storyline. By chapter 800, we need to be finishing Dressrosa and starting the Four Emperors saga. By chapter 900, we need to be closing Whole Cake Island and starting Wano. By chapter 1000, we need to be wrapping up the first half of Wano, etc. Now, that might sound obvious that, an author is writing with benchmarks in mind for how long the story should go, But my point is that, first of all, I don't think that Oda was writing towards chapter 1000 necessarily with the goal that this has to be some mind-blowing chapter, but rather with the goal of how much story ground should be covered by the time we get to chapter 1000. As I mentioned before, it looks like Act 3 is very possibly going to end at actually about chapter 1002. And obviously Oda isn't going to be perfectly exact with how he does all this. Like, I bet he would have also liked to have finished Whole Cake Island exactly at chapter 900 and was just a couple chapters off, just as maybe he would have liked to have ended Act 3 at chapter 1000 and is going to be a couple chapters off again. But I would guess that these are just general benchmarks, like roughly chapter 900, roughly chapter 1000, he's trying to roughly stick to so that he can cover story ground and finish arcs at a certain pace. And along those lines, I would bet that a lot of these cool little coincidences we end up getting, like Oden's boiling happening on Oden Day, or Gear 4th debuting on the reverse of Gear 2nd's chapter debut, are very likely just mini benchmarks Oda sees along the way that he could hit that happen to come up as possibilities organically in the process of writing. For example, if Oda's writing Dressrosa and he knows that he wants the story to wrap up by about chapter 800, then maybe Gear 4th should come out against Doflamingo somewhere in the 780 range, and oh look, if it happened to come out on chapter 783 specifically, then that would be a cool little callback to Gear 2nd's debut, so then Oda can just use that as a little mini benchmark while writing the arc. He probably has like a dozen other benchmarks in mind, like Birdcage should come out by this chapter, Luffy and Law should reach the King's Castle by this chapter, etc. And then Gear 4th coming out on chapter 783 is probably just one of many such benchmarks, and it happens to be one that we the readers can pick up on because it's one that Oda's making obvious to us. Same with the Oden Day thing. Oda's probably got some goal of, okay, the Oden flashback should be wrapping up around this point, that keeps things on track so that Act 3 can end around chapter 1000, and then that also fits in with this possible pattern of Act 1 being 15 chapters, Act 2 being 30 chapters, Act 3 potentially being 45, etc. So all that is to say that from seeing chapter 700, chapter 800, chapter 900, and so on come and go, I've learned not to expect some crazy event to necessarily happen on that specific chapter. I know that Oda tries to make those somewhat special chapters as much as he can because he knows that the reader expects it to a degree, but in general, these milestones matter probably more so in terms of the pacing out of the story in a broader sense. So if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon for my Extended Thoughts podcast on this and all future topics. Talk to you all later.